Welcome to More Than Profit. With me today is Ben Reno-Weber, dear friend and huge community mobilizer. So I wanted to start off, born and raised in Louisville. Talk to me a little bit about your upbringing, your parents. How has that shaped your perspective on the world, our community, work itself?
Oh, all of that.
All of that.
Wow. All right. So grew up in Louisville. Neither of my parents are from here. And they moved for my father to become a professor at the University of Louisville. When my father pitched the idea to my mother, it was a 3-year time frame. And the way he pitched it was, I'm going to spend 3 years teaching kids for whom this is their first generation in their family going to college and probably their only shot at it. And we'll do it for 3 years, and then we'll continue with the original plan, which is to go somewhere else. To a more prestigious university, and that didn't happen. He came and he fell in love with the city and with the university and with that part of the mission.
And this was about what time period?
This was in the late 70s.
Late 70s.
And
you were a young whippersnapper?
I was not born yet. And what an odd piece of my life is that at one point my father was a priest and my mother was a nun. And they left separately, but they both very much had values that were other than let me maximize the financial possibilities of my career. And I think that very much permeated my growing up.
In what ways?
Well, I mean, I think what my parents said very clearly to me was, it is great to take care of you and yours, but if that is all you do, with all of the investment that's been made in you, you have failed. And I think that was always sort of a part of the framing and the upbringing.
Is there a particular memory you have from your father, your mother, that is kind of stuck in your brain that has really helped shape that thinking for you personally?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I remember very clearly, so my father took a second job so that I could go to a private school because my parents, both as first generation, were insecure about whether or not I was going to stay in the middle class. And they definitely had a feeling like, they wanted for me the opportunity to have options, to be whatever I wanted to be. And I remember pulling up to this school that I knew that my father was working weekends so that I could attend. And we had this like beat up old Buick. And we were in this parking lot and I felt embarrassed about all these other cars that were there. And I turned to my dad and I was like, Dad, hey, I know we're poor. And he just laughed. And he said, son, first off, this is not poverty, right? Poverty is not driving a car. And second off, we are so rich in the ways that we want to be.
That's awesome. And so what happened next? So you're raised by a pretty interesting couple, former nun, former priest, instilled these amazing values of community and otherness. Where'd you go after that?
So I looked around at a lot of different schools. It wasn't, also just part of the cultural programming. I didn't realize that it was possible to not go to college. Also growing up in Louisville, Kentucky, I didn't realize it was possible to not go to the NCAA tournament. I just didn't know that was a thing. I wasn't until I went to school at George Washington and they were like, we got into the NCAA tournament, which they had for the first year, my freshman year in like 15 years. And I was like, what do you mean? And then I vaguely remember that there was this thing called the NIT that we did once when I was like 9. So I didn't know you couldn't go to college. Everyone went to college. And I was told you go to college and then you do some interesting things there. And that's what you do. So I went to George Washington. I majored in international affairs, which was a great decision in lots of ways, but mostly because it was something I cared about. So I was positive that I was going to go give kids in developing countries immunizations. That was I was going to do that.
I was wondering what you do with international affairs.
Yeah. Would you like fries with that in like 6 languages? So I spent one summer in the Dominican Republic, and then I was very convinced in a 19-year-old way that the Latin America was never going to make it economically. Just never. I was positive about that because of what I had experienced there. And so I ended up studying Russian because I needed a language. And I went there for a semester, and I lived in St. Petersburg, and I taught English. And that actually led me in a roundabout way to Bosnia, where this post-war country And what was really fascinating to me about Bosnia and actually about Russia was how clear they were about what parts of their culture they valued more than money. Or alongside money. I mean, it was there in Russia, there was this real sense of loss. Like, yes, our economy does not function in the way that it did. And we feel at that point sort of impotent on the global stage where once we were powerful. But really, they felt the loss of that sense of community and purpose that was such a part of their culture for the previous century. You know, you go to Russia and you ask, like, what are you most proud of as a country? They defeated the Nazis. We were like an ancillary little like speck in that conflict, and they did that. And you look at the numbers, that's really true. And they, you know, they were trying to accomplish something. And then in Bosnia, we used to joke all the time, you know, you guys have Starbucks and we have coffee. And in the Bosnian language, you don't have coffee as something you consume. You go to coffee. It is a process that you do either with yourself or with your friends. And I was so struck by that. At the same time that I recognized that people in poverty, the desperation and the lack of choices that come out of that are really disempowering. Yeah. So there was this weird piece of me growing up seeing the choices that my parents made, both that were beyond and different than maximizing the money that they could make, but also aware of not being poor.
Sure.
And how important that was. And then same thing as I got through my formative times in college and after, really living in cultures where poverty was a real driver of all sorts of terrible things.
Sure.
But wealth was not the end objective.
So set the stage here, context-wise. You're in Bosnia. What time period is this?
So I got there the first time in 2000, and then I went back to live in 2003. Okay. And I was there for 2.5 years.
Wow. So in your travels to the Dominican, Russia, and Bosnia, did you have any similar Buick moments where you're reminded of kind of this thing from your father, this subtle kind of, hey, we're not poor. This is not poverty. And then to see in the people that you're interacting with, just a genuine sense of community despite potentially their condition or their circumstance.
Yeah. I mean, I think everywhere you would go, even as a 20-something-year-old, I got paid locally a huge amount of money. I was never, was never a question in any of those circumstances that I had means that most of the people that I hung around with did not. And I could leave, which is its own...
It's an interesting thing, isn't it?
The freedom to leave, to change, to have power over your circumstances.
The agency over your own situation, correct?
Agency over your own situation, to me, is this incredible value. And that was sort of a piece of what was interesting to me about, part of what I did in the Balkans was microfinance. So we would, very small loans, very poor people, mostly women, but not entirely. And what that really meant for people was well beyond the money that could be earned. It was the control over how they spent their days. Even if what that meant, I heard this great joke a couple of weeks ago, an entrepreneur is the sort of person who works 80 hours a week so they don't have to work 40. Right? Even if what that meant was, you're up at 5 a.m. and you're baking empanadas so that you can be out on the street selling those empanadas when you could be working somewhere else, if that's an option, right? So if you have that agency, and you work twice as hard, but it's your work, it's love. Mm-hmm. And I think that gets into what has essentially become a lifelong obsession, which is, why do people work?
Yeah. Well, and that kind of leads into, there's what shaped you from your parents, your experiences in Louisville, then Eastern Europe, Dominican. What's becoming your own? At this point in your life, you're in probably your 20s.
Yeah, sort of, right.
What kind of rules are now driving Ben's life? Like, what would you say you kind of co-opted as some of the things that you hold dear, not just lessons you've learned from your parents?
Yeah. It's funny. So a group of my friends from middle school got together, and over the fall we went and we had a halftime party. we sort of were like, hey, we're probably statistically, we are at about half of our lifespan. What are we thinking about that, the last half and the next half? And I think I'm extraordinarily fortunate that I do have so much agency to choose what kind of job I want to have, to choose where I want to be. And so I think there is some responsibility with that power to be using that well. I mean, I have a lot of investment has been made in me as a human being, as in you. So I think part of what I'm really thinking about is how do I use that? How do we use that to really create opportunities for other people? I heard this great talk the other day by Matthew Barzin, who was the American ambassador to the UK. And he was talking about letting people reach their potential, but not as a static end, right? There's no winning life, right? But to create opportunities for people to find a struggle that is worthy of them, right? I mean, I think the sort of the power of my education and the fact that I took a lot of advantage of that education, you know,
Sure.
people who are like, oh, you're so privileged, which is totally true. I am. But what that meant was that when I worked hard, that got better results. It didn't mean I didn't work hard.
For sure. So the Balkans, you're still away from Louisville. You go where? You go to grad school, right?
So I came back. So my father got sick in 2005 and passed at the end of 2005. So I came back here, took care of him, took care of my mom, and spent a year here. And then while he was sick, one of his sort of was like, well, okay, now it's a good time to study, to go to grad school. So then went to grad school, met my wife in Boston singing karaoke in the basement bar of Pizzeria Uno's on JFK, which recently closed.
That's a great story.
Yeah.
Do you remember what you were singing?
Oh, it was kamikaze karaoke. So you don't know what the song is until you get up.
That's great.
And I got Build Me Up Buttercup.
Even better.
Yeah, duet. So I looked around for the hottest girl in the bar.
There you go.
Yeah.
And now you're married.
And now we're married.
That's awesome. So go to grad school.
Studied public policy and business.
Okay.
Because I was really interested in how do you use business principles to empower people?
So this whole time, you know.
Yeah, I got obsessed. I've been obsessed.
Okay.
I've been obsessed the whole time.
Yeah.
What does it look like to give people agency and a voice? And then what does that mean for them?
That's great.
And there's lots of different dimensions to that.
Yeah. So you came back, which in our community, many communities, that's not always the case. But you ended up moving back to Louisville.
Yeah. So after grad school, I went to go work for the Boston Consulting Group.
Okay.
Where I was with a lot of people who had very different motivations than I did, coming from very different backgrounds, or very similar backgrounds. And I think, I will forever be grateful to them for all that they taught me and for all that they brought to me, and for the experiences that they let me have, and for the way that they let me go when they realized, and I realized, that it wasn't a good fit anymore.
And then that's kind of what brought you back to Louisville?
Yeah, I ended up, I ran into the CEO of this nonprofit that had been really impactful in my life, the Kentucky YMCA. And so that was a nonprofit dedicated to empowering youth voices, particularly marginalized youth voices. And the CEO was on a train that I was on from New York to DC. And he just got on it. It was just one of those finger of God moments where you're like, hey, what are you doing? I haven't seen you in forever. And he said, oh, I'm retiring. I said, who's going to take your job? And he said, well, we don't know. I think they're going to do a national search. I was like, well, I'm national. And so I was I rolled off a client. They were rolling me onto another one. And I had gone through this interview process, but I was really still soul searching because it was a substantial salary cut.
Sure.
My wife, the Yankee, I had to say, hey, honey, what would you think about moving to Kentucky? She said, I have never thought about Kentucky, full stop. But she could see that I was really passionate about it. And I was like, having played this game before or seen this game before, I was like, well, honey, we'll just go for 3 years. And we'll work for this organization.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah. But I think what we found in being here was both an organization that I could be really passionate about, and then a community that was of a size that was really, she says all the time, it is a canvas that is big enough to be worth painting on and small enough that everyone's paint matters.
That's a really good picture. Okay, so born and raised in Louisville, moved away, got some experience, really impacted by your parents, seen a lot, learned a lot, trying to figure out how to use your power for the benefit of others. What drives you today? Like as you think about community, coming back now more than 3 years into the commitment with your wife, like what's really driving Ben as you think about your life today and what you're kind of pressing into in the near term?
So I think the piece that drives me right now is the same thing that drives most people most of the time, that we let get totally masked by money. Right? So you get into any of the scholarship around what actually motivates people. Probably my favorite popularizer of this stuff is Daniel Pink. Mm-hmm. And he says, what motivates people? It's autonomy, mastery, purpose, and community. And so when I left the Y, I did this tech startup, Mobile Serve, that was engaging volunteers. And, the conversation that people would have with me all the time is like, I would totally volunteer. I just don't know where to volunteer, which is total malarkey, right? If you cared enough to try and figure out where to volunteer, you would Google it, right?
For sure.
So it's not actually the case. What gets people to volunteer is a personal invitation. And what gets them to come back are those things: autonomy, mastery, purpose, community, right? And so part of what we did with the tech platform was try to help enable that. But part of what gets me fired up now is still trying to think about those things. Like, what does it mean for someone in our community to have those things, to have choices about what they do with their time and their resources, to be, during the course of their investment of that time, be validated for the skills that they have or are building, to be a part of something that is bigger than themselves, to be creating something powerful, and then to be doing that in community. I mean, so that's when you ask me sort of broadly, what motivates me or what gets me fired up, it's those things. I want to be doing those things for myself. And I want to be doing them in a way that gives more people in our community access to those things.
That's great. And so recently you started a new gig. So
yeah,
quite an interesting past, especially with a recent tech startup, but more recently, really an exciting new venture.
Yeah.
What drove you to kind of plug in there, and what are you excited about with that opportunity for our community?
Yeah, so I am the newly minted director of the Future of Work initiative in Louisville, which was funded by a grant from Microsoft and sort of really brought here by the city of Louisville. It's the purpose of the initiative is to really establish Louisville as a hub for the data economy. So thinking about the technologies that are coming, how do we position this relatively small city on the border of the South and the Midwest as being on the cutting edge of this tech revolution? And particularly, how do we do that in a way that is inclusive of people who basically missed out on the last couple of tech revolutions? And what's fun about it is that lots and lots of people here and nationally have identified Louisville as being on the cusp of doing these things. So it's really fun.
What are those indicators that you're hearing?
Yeah, so if you think about the pieces of what the next tech revolution is, it's really the big data revolution. So the last three, personal computing, internet, and mobile, all kind of started on the coasts, jumped from the West Coast to the East Coast. A lot of computer science folks drove that, which means that it was those problems that got solved, right? The people that understood the technology and then also had access to the business experience and finance that they needed to grow businesses using that technology. So this is really an intentional attempt to change that for this next tech revolution. So big data, people talk a lot about AI, they talk a lot about the Internet of Things, but basically the whole premise is recognizing that your data has value and using it to connect dots in order to enable you to make better decisions. So that involves a lot of, so there's some technical pieces to that, right? That is very clear. But I think the most interesting parts of the next tech revolution have nothing to do with the tech. As Jeff Guam, who's a professor at the University of Louisville, says, the tech has evolved to the point where we can actually start solving problems. So what does solving those problems look like? Well, first off, we have to say, well, what are the problems we're trying to solve? Oh, we're trying to solve as a society, let's say we want to reduce healthcare costs and we want to improve outcomes for the investments that we're making. We make the most investment per capita of any country in health, and we get some of the worst results for that investment. Well, why? So the premise of big data is that we could then go in and say, well, let's look at what are the drivers of those costs. Oh, okay, it's ER utilization is a big driver. Well, what causes people to use the ER? Well, lots of things do, but most of those things have nothing to do with clinical care. They have everything to do with social causes, health-related determinants, things like if you are evicted, you are likely to visit the ER at least twice in the next 6 months because that's where you can get healthcare, right? So what would it look like for us to be able to say, oh, this person is in danger of eviction based on information that we have pulled from these variety of sources and intervene upstream? $400 to pay some utility bills stops that person from getting evicted, which is hugely disruptive for their lives, terrible for children in that house in terms of their educational outcomes, in terms of their sense of place and purpose, and also costs $20,000 for those 2 ER admissions. So all of these pieces align. It is in the financial interest, it is in the moral interest, it is in the educational interests of our society to prevent that. And if we can spend $400, that is a great investment.
Yeah.
But we have to have the information to say that it's worth to spend those $400.
Yeah, and see that's an interesting perspective, because I think some of the conversations you and I have had offline around AI automation are just the scary factor.
Yeah.
The job replacement,
totally.
The kind of just the impact that this is going to have on the future of our economy, the workforce, the labor market, and just how inevitably it could lead to increased exclusion from or increased barriers to employment. So it's interesting to hear that perspective, and it kind of ties, I think, a little bit to what drives you as it relates to kind of your upbringing leading to this moment at Microsoft and the future of work. How do you think what you're doing at Microsoft ties and what you're excited about there, and even things you'll get into in the future, even beyond this work, that really drive you in this next season of your life? What are you really excited to press into?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so first off, I don't want to minimize at all any of the potential disruption that this technology or the automation pieces of this can bring. I think there's real potential for this to be destructive if not dealt with well. I think what drives me is really the potential to recognize value in all these little places where we just haven't been able to do the analysis that will enable us to recognize that value, to create that thing. I mean, part of what was fun for me about creating a company was, there's all this time that is being wasted by, in our case, it was guidance counselors physically recording service hours, or companies, trying to get their employees to this place at this time in this number, that then all of a sudden could turn around to time that guidance counselor had to spend with those students, right? Doing the things that really added human value. So to me, part of what's exciting about this, looking at some of these new technologies, is that a lot of the stuff that's going to get reduced or eliminated is stuff that stinks. That's drudgerous, dangerous, just where if we can reallocate those human resources to do more things, that's really fun. Now, it's possible that what happens is, that job goes away, and for that person, there's not another alternative. I don't want to in any way minimize that. But it is not the history of technology that's how this worked out. When we invented the loom and made it cheaper for people to have clothing, that didn't mean that all of the people who were involved in that all of a sudden didn't have jobs. It meant that we had more than one set of clean clothes. We didn't reduce the amount of housework that was being done in a house by automating a bunch of it, we increased our standards of cleanliness.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And so I think that's a lot of the stuff. You talk to some of the people, about what's going to happen. Well, it's not that we're not going to have auditors. It's that they're going to be able to get more fraudulent transactions, and they're going to start auditing code and all these other things that they're going to be creating value. It's just different value.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting and exciting is the way you describe it is I think a mature, idealized reality. And it's great to hear people like yourself trying to plug into that and figure it out, because you could see technology improperly applied does lead to exclusion because it's about efficiency. And so we replace jobs with technology. And I think that's the big fear. But to hear you talk about this really kind of gets, at least what I'm thinking is really, what is the purpose of work?
What is the purpose of work?
And how does the purpose of work, how does technology apply to the purpose of work? And if the goal of technology properly applied can improve a person's work and value and contribution to the economy, will they not have greater autonomy, community, some of the things that you were listing? Yeah. So what do you see as the connection and the exciting point on like the future of work, the purpose of work? Is there anything that you're...
All right. So two questions that sort of follow up on that. So if I gave you 5 hours a week that you couldn't spend with your family and you couldn't spend working, what would you do with it?
Fly fish.
Right? Right. You'd find something that feeds you. Now, fly fishing isn't easy, right? It is not a pure, it is an activity that you're doing for a purpose at which you get better. You get to decide where you're going to go. I mean, this fits the things. Now, fly fishing might not be community, but... Yeah.
Well, I mean, like my current thing is chainsawing on my farm, but that's another story.
Right, that. But it's productive things. If you had that time back...
Yeah.
And, you would spend it on things that were creating value in your life as you see it. And so to me, this gets into the question of the purpose of work. Now, this all is premised on a lens where I am not working for survival, right? I have hit a level of material success that means that I'm not thinking about, as my wife's family says, being middle class means never using the phrase gas money, right?
Yeah. Good
it means you never think about how much it costs you to get from point A to point B.
Yeah.
Right? That's middle class. Okay, so this presumes that you have hit some sort of material level where you're not constantly anxious about money. And then after that, the purpose of work becomes more about this self-actualization. Right? Yeah. What can I do with that? So I think that to me is exciting, the idea that we could, because there's two ways to pull people out of poverty. Right. One is you help them through a set of programs to where it raises them up out of poverty, and you can sort of turn the dials on how much of that is work or work requirement or program or there's lots of different ways to go about that. But there's essentially do what you're doing and we'll get you to a certain material level. The other thing is to make their labor more valuable. So if all of a sudden, I was talking yesterday to a startup that does work with home health workers, and they're like, oh, we're starting to recognize that part of the data that we're collecting has value, for these people in their homes, and we might be able to package that and then offer additional services to insurance companies based on what we know about the people that they insure and they don't know. Well, all of a sudden, that $9 an hour worker is creating value that's more than $9 an hour if he or she knows how to record that data in a clean way, and then that goes up into the system. And then, there's some policy things around whether or not the company chooses to pay that person more. But at least that's an option because they're creating more value.
Sure.
And that's where, to me, the idea is how do we empower people to create more value and spend less time doing things that stink?
That's great. So back to the quote from Daniel Pink in Community, and just kind of what I'm hearing as a theme is just your passion for community, for building community, realizing the purpose of work and giving people autonomy over their work, recognizing that some need gas money and they're not there yet. They can't fully realize that. So what gives you hope? I mean, in the midst of kind of what we see out there, what we experience even in the small market of Louisville, Kentucky, the politics of things, like what gives you hope?
So I think there are two things. One, I'm actually given hope by the idea that a lot of these social ends can be accomplished whether or not you care about the social ends. That we're finally in a place where people are starting to do the math on, turnover in my company is X, so if I create better conditions or better pay, turnover will go down. Or, gosh, I'm paying all this for managing chronic diseases. Wouldn't it be better if we just didn't have those chronic diseases? So you don't actually have to care to be invested in creating better outcomes for people, and that gives me hope. Because there are a certain set of people that actually just don't care that much.
Yeah.
I find that personally
but
very
if you can
frustrating. But hey, listen, give
them a bottom line reason, hey, this is.
And then the other piece is that I think there is actually an increasing vocabulary for talking about that people do care. We've got all this language now around social impact investing or patient capital or non-traditional capital or access and equity. I mean, all these conversations that we weren't having 10 years ago, or we were having in very limited fashions, are now really mainstream. And to me, that gives me hope because it gives us a much more nuanced way of engaging people. There's a certain set of people that you can say, hey, I want to try and solve this social problem. Will you give me money? And they'll say yes. And that's great, but that's not enough. It clearly hasn't worked.
Yeah.
And so the idea that we could say, well, what if instead of getting a 4% rate of return, you'd get a 3% rate of return? And at the same time, or we would do that 4%, but it'd be over 10 years. And at the same time, you can feel really good about how that money is working to create better outcomes.